Hello, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. I teach at the University of Colorado Boulder, previously at UC Berkeley and UCLA. Several manuscripts include the poems about the Norse gods that are included in modern editions and translations of the Poetic Edda. By far the most important and comprehensive is the manuscript called the Codex Regius, or Konungsbok. Those are its Latin and Icelandic names, which mean the same thing, Book of the King, because the manuscript was presented to the Danish king in the 1600s by its finder, Brynjolfur Sveinsson. The Poetic Edda, when we speak of it today, is based around the contents of the Codex Regius. That does not mean that all of the poems that contain material about the Norse gods are in it, but most of the poems that are in the Codex Regius are not found anywhere else, such as Havamal, the words of Odin. There are poems about both gods and heroes in the Codex Regius, and this presentation I just want to focus on the poems about the gods, since those are the ones that people are typically most interested in. There are 11 poems that concern subjects that are not focused on human heroes in the Codex Regius. Two of those, Volundarkvida and Alvismal, are focused on an elf and a dwarf, respectively, so people disagree on whether to include those in poems about the gods or poems about the heroes. I prefer to consider them with poems about the gods, since they focus on creatures that are not human. Of those poems, there are also several that are quoted in the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson, a separate book. These include Volaspal, Havamal, Vafthrudnismal, Grímnismal, Forskirnis, Lokasenna, Alvismal, Volspa and Skama, and Grótasöngr. Those last two are not included in the Codex Regius. Now there's a separate Old Icelandic manuscript, AM 748, 1 Quarto. AM stands for the collection of Árni Magnússon. This manuscript has at least parts of Vafthrudnismal, Grímnismal, Forskirnis, Horfasögn, and Heimaskviða, which are also in the Codex Regius. And then this manuscript is our sole source for the poem called Baldursdramar, or Vegtamskviða. There is also the manuscript called Hauksbók. This is actually preserved in several fragments, so there isn't a single catalog number. And that manuscript includes an important variant of the poem Volaspal, which has a somewhat different flair to it. It's actually a little bit shorter than the one in the Codex Regius, but it includes a famous stanza that seems to allude to the coming of Christ after Ragnarok, making many people think that it has been influenced to a much greater degree by later Christian tradition in Iceland. There's also the Codex Wormianus, or Ormsbok. That is AM 242 folio. That manuscript includes the poem Ríkstula, which is our story about the god Heimdallr fathering the classes of human beings. That is actually a manuscript of the Prose Edda, but that poem is not quoted in the Prose Edda. It's presented as a somewhat separate work, much as the grammatical treatises are. Then there's also the Flatøyarbók, Codex Flatøyensis. This is GKS 1005 folio. That includes the entirety of the poem called Volspa and Skama, or Hylliljóð. As to the ages of these, I've gone in roughly chronological order. Konungsbok, Codex Regius, is written about 1270, but we can tell from copying errors that it's copied from an original written about 1200. Interestingly, Havamal was probably copied from a different manuscript than the rest of the poems in the Codex Regius. Snorri's Prose Edda, which quotes many of these poems, was probably written originally in the 1220s. Earliest manuscript evidence is from about 100 years later, probably about the 1320s is our earliest preserved manuscript of the Prose Edda. AM 78, 1 Quarto, about 1300, Hauksbók, about 1350, Ormsbok, about 1350, and then Flatøyarbók, about 1400. So these 6 manuscript sources, roughly, of course, calling the Prose Edda one manuscript source is fudging it a little bit. There's 4 good old manuscripts of the Prose Edda, are our physical links to the poetry of the Viking Age. But as I've discussed elsewhere, there are many reasons for believing that at least the majority of these poems were composed originally in the late Viking Age, including Havamal and Volaspal, the 2 probably most important poems for an understanding of Norse mythology. If you are interested in the Poetic Edda, I hope that you'll check out my translation, which has been available since 2015 from Hackett, and in the next few years, my translation of Snorri's Prose Edda will also become available. I have a Patreon if you want to help me continue to make these videos in beautiful locations for free. And for now, from beautiful New Mexico, I'm wishing you all the best.